Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. Today, I will be interviewing Ed Glaeser. He is a professor of economics at Harvard University and is by far one of the most influential urban economists, but he is also one of the most fervent advocates for cities as places that foster human achievement. He is the author of the book Triumph of Cities and many other articles. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Before we start, I would like to ask you a question that I ask all my guests. What is the most important that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
When I interact with my students, particularly the ones who are, I think, a bit younger than you, I think the most important thing that they underestimate is how much they have to learn from the people around them. That in fact, we are exceptional as a species, not in our own innate brilliance or our innate capacity. We are exceptional in our ability to borrow ideas, knowledge, insight, and experience from those other human beings that are around us. And so, that requires constant humility and a constant respect for other people. And that is where wisdom comes from, is never trying to make an important decision entirely on your own.
Wow. Yeah. So now let's jump right in. That's a really good response. I've heard you say that, quote, at their hearts, cities are the absence of physical space between people. Cities are density, proximity, closeness, end quote, which I'm sure sounds kind of claustrophobic for a lot of people, especially in the middle of a pandemic. But in your book, Triumph of Cities, you make the case that, quote, cities magnify humanity's strengths, end quote. What do you mean by that?
Well, my answer to that is basically a continuation of my last answer, which is that cities enable us to work together with other human beings. They enable us to connect with each other more easily, whether or not in the workplace or socially, because there's less physical distance between us. They enable us to share common resources like a park or a museum. And cities have been enabling these bursts of collaborative creativity for thousands of years, since Socrates and Plato bickered on an Athenian street corner. That's the sense in which they make us more human. That if you think that humans are basically a deeply collaborative species, since cities are about empowering collaboration, they fundamentally make us more human. And another way of just saying this is that any person on their own, few of us can actually take on even a reasonably sized black bear. Right? Together, we're able to do amazing things, from Athenian philosophy to Renaissance art to the gifts of the internet. And all of that's made possible by collaboration, and much of the most important forms of that collaboration have taken place in cities.
Can you give us some examples about how or of how cities spur this innovation and how they attract talent and how they encourage entrepreneurship?
Sure. So those are, I'll do a couple of different ones. Usually I find examples from history to be particularly helpful. And, often the way that we see art, innovation is often in the arts, which doesn't necessarily mean that that's unique or particularly special, but it is a valuable source of how ideas spread. So if you think about Renaissance Florence, so think about 1400 in this city, and keep in mind it's a city that is at that point in time, filthy, subject to plague, and it's a city that's built on the fairly prosaic tasks of wool weaving and banking. And in that city, the desire for public art leads Brunelleschi to experiment. And there's a famous experiment of him working with mirrors around the Duomo, around the cathedral, to experiment with linear perspective, how to make a two-dimensional surface appear deep, appear three-dimensional. And he basically figures out about how vanishing points work and how you can make two-dimensional spaces seem like they have depth. He is near neighbors. He's close friends with the young architect and sculptor Donatello, the ink sculptor Donatello. And they go traveling together in Rome to learn more about the classics. But Donatello then picks up, right, from Brunelleschi this art of making two-dimensional spaces three-dimensional, and he puts it in sculpture and the walls of Orsa Michele in Florence. Then uh, Donatello passes it along to Masaccio, right, a painter, again, right next to him, cheek by jowl. They're all working on the same things. They're all connected to each other. They're all learning from each other, right? And Masaccio puts it on the wall, uses this two-dimensional depth to put on the walls of the Brancacci Chapel. Marvelous painting of Saint Peter finding a silver coin in the belly of a fish, and he's all of a sudden he's giving depth and action to paintings which used to be sort of simple uh, views, portraits of saints, of the Madonna. That then gets picked up by that less than saintly Florentine monk Fra Filippo Lippi, then passes it along to Botticelli, who's his student. Each of these people knew each other. Each of these people see each other's art, and they have to be there in the city for this chain of collaboration that ultimately results in this pictorial renaissance to occur. This is what cities do that really matters. I can tell you a similar story about the chain of brilliance that occurred in Detroit in 1890, where Americans certainly didn't invent the car. I think usually credit for the internal combustion engine is given to Germans like Nicholas Otto and Daimler. But Americans do figure out how to make cars cheap. And Henry Ford may be first among equals, but Ford isn't in this alone. He's surrounded by this cluster of innovative genius, the Dodge brothers, the Fisher brothers, Ransom E. Olds, Billy Durant, and all of these guys are stealing each other's ideas, helping each other with parts, helping each other with financing. It's sort of a cluster of genius that, again, it's repeated in Silicon Valley in the 1960s. And this is what cities do that sort of leaves the most lasting trace, is the fact that we unlock human genius because we are borrowing each other's ideas.
So, how do cities then allow for social and economic mobility?
So, at their best, they are also machines for learning for ordinary people. So, just as they create sort of these high level bursts of genius, like the moving assembly line that Ford does, they also enable you to learn, very basic things. I think most people should have experiences from their own life that make this resonate, of places where they came, and because they were around smart people, they actually became more productive. Certainly, my entire early 20s is about being around extraordinary economists like Gary Becker and Bob Lucas, and picking up little tidbits just by being near them. Um, but we see this also in the data. We see this in US data, and even better data that Diego Puga has put together for Spain, that when you look at people who come to cities, what happens is they don't experience a massive wage boost immediately, but rather year by year, month by month, by moving into a big city, to a Chicago, to a New York, to a Barcelona, to Madrid, what you see is faster wage growth. Cities are, forges of human capital, of places where people get smart by being around other smart people. That's what the English economist Alfred Marshall was talking about when he wrote in the 19th century, that in dense clusters, the mysteries of the trade become no mystery, but are as it were in the air. So you see this sort of faster wage growth in cities. And then when people leave cities, they generally take the wage growth that they've accumulated with them, which is sort of, again, compatible with this view that they are actually acquiring skills, acquiring usable knowledge. Think about all the young people who sort of ran to Silicon Valley over the last 25 years to be part of that technology world. I think the right interpretation is they were hoping to be around people who would help them become more productive and more innovative. And that's cities at their best. On the other hand, we've had some very disturbing urban data over the past couple of years that's come out of my colleagues Raj Chetty and John Friedman and Nathan Hendren, and their work on the Opportunity Atlas, which suggests that cities have not been doing a great job of fostering opportunity for kids who are growing up in them. And in some sense, that should remind us of how different the experience of a poor adult and a poor kid can be in a city. So if you're a poor New Yorker living in one of the outer boroughs, you're likely to be getting on a subway at the beginning of the day, and it's a hard life, but you're going in to work in a place that's very crowded and dense with activity, people from all sorts of different walks of life. If you're a poor kid in the same area, you're likely to be living in your highly segregated block and then going to your highly segregated school. And for you, the city might as well be an island of deprivation. And so cities do appear to be working in different ways for people who are different parts of the age distribution. And when I think about the sort of greatest failing of cities, it is the fact that they're not turning poor kids into richer adults.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there are many challenges. often the schools expect more of the parents than the parents are able to give. But ultimately, as much as you'd like to change lots of things in the environment of poor kids, and neighborhoods also matter, the presence of role models also matters. Ultimately, the tool that we have in this country, in this society, for upward mobility is fundamentally the school system. And we need to figure out how to make urban schools more likely to be fonts of opportunity than places where kids too often dead end. The urban school reform movement has been going around for 25 years. I've been, engaged in it in different ways over that time period, and it is discouraging how long it has taken to sort of make urban schools better. There have been improvements in Chicago over the past decade. There were improvements in the Bloomberg administration in New York, but the going has been very, very slow. One of my personal pet ideas is the idea of doing more that sort of doesn't end run around the school system. So leaving the existing school system untouched, but doing more to provide after school vocational programs for teenagers in the schools, weekends, summer programs. And in that case, in some sense, you can maybe avoid some of the institutional barriers that make school reform hard, like the existing teachers unions agreements. And the idea would be that for vocational skills, you can competitively source it. I mean, the unions can participate in this. So can the trade unions. So can for profits. So can not for profits. And then you're going to competitively evaluate at the end of each class, at the end of the module, whether or not the child has learned something useful, right? Because the beauty of training someone to be a plumber or electrician or even a computer programmer is you don't have to wait 15 years to know if they've learned how to be a more, whole human being. You can actually see how they're doing on those basic skills right at the point of graduation.
That makes sense. So, in a TED talk of yours, I heard that you mentioned that when you compare countries that have more than 50%, that are more than 50% urbanized, and you compare them to countries that are less than 50% urbanized, the countries that are more urbanized on average have incomes 5 times higher than the less urbanized countries. But you also noted that infant mortality rate is less than one third the rate in less urbanized countries. Can you explain the kind of relationship, the connection between high density and low infant mortality rate?
So that's a modern phenomenon. So again, if you go back to 1900, a boy born in New York City could expect to live 6 years less than a boy born in rural America. And much of that difference was infant mortality at birth. So in the world pre 1910, when contagious disease was still stalking all our major urban areas, our cities were killing fields. And they have been killing fields for centuries, right? Since the plague of Athens slew Pericles in 430 BC, or the plague of Justinian came to Constantinople in 541, 542 AD. Um, but the past century has been, at least until now, a remarkably healthy time for cities. And what those facts across countries basically reflect the fact that there's just this extraordinary correlation between being highly urban and being wealthier across countries, and there's a correlation within countries in that the people who live in more urbanized areas, particularly in poorer parts of the world, are generally much richer. And so for poor countries, I'm not saying that you should ever force people to urbanize or that you should sort of artificially drive urbanization up, but I know of no pathway out of poverty into prosperity that doesn't run through city streets. And this process through which the poorer parts of the world connect to the global economy through cities is the best thing we've ever seen out there in terms of economic transformation. And when people get richer, they invest in the public health tools that they need to stop infant mortality. They live in places where you have hospitals and doctors. And so cities can be healthy, except when you have a plague that you don't know how to fix, that you don't know how to vaccinate against. And when that plague is running rampant, then cities become more dangerous. And we're experiencing that today.
I mean, yeah. Another interesting fact of your research is that in the beginning of the 19th century, people left cities and they wanted to occupy the space more out west in the middle of the country. But then at the beginning of this century, the 21st century, instead of spreading out, we're kind of coming back in. Your data shows that cities that start off as more crowded grow even faster than cities that start off less crowded. Why is it like that? Why is that so?
Well, I think this reflects just the high level of demand, again, pre COVID 19, for urban density in the 21st century. So, what, and this was something of a surprise because when I started doing research on cities in the 1980s, the prognosticators, the cyber seers, the techno prophets, were all predicting that the information technology would make face to face contact in the cities that enable that contact obsolete. So they were pointing to a world that would feel a lot like the world we're currently experiencing, in which we'd all, shelter in cottages and electronic cottages and just dial it in. But that isn't at all what happened. And I think there are two reasons: one to do with production, the other have to do with pleasure. On the production side, what globalization and new technologies have done is that they have radically increased the returns to being smart, and they've increased the returns to innovation. And we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people, and that has become only more valuable over time. The more complicated an idea is, the easier it is for that idea to get lost in translation. And face to face contact makes it easier for us to communicate complicated thoughts. And the world is only getting more complicated. And so that's the work side of why cities came back and why demand for urban space has been so robust over the past 20 years. But of course, it's not just about the work side. And you see that in the sense that within big cities, there's been a real tilt, not just towards commercial real estate downtown, but even more so towards residential real estate downtown. And that's reflecting the fact that there has been a rise of cities as places of pleasure, of consumer cities. And that's about the urban edge in just providing fun. The same urban advantage in innovation and entrepreneurship that makes cities more productive also makes them more enjoyable, right? Also means that you get more cool restaurants, more cool food trucks, more of an ability to just have a good time. And, the ability to connect with other human beings is sort of a particular source of joy, at least when you get to choose which human beings you connect with. And, I don't, I have a line in my book called, which is something like connecting in cyberspace is never going to compare with sharing a meal or a kiss or a smile. And I think for many of your listeners, while they may have been able to continue their jobs long distance, I can't imagine that any of them isn't hungry for more contact with real human beings in real physical space. And that's what cities do. Cities deliver that contact.
You also, in your work, point out problems with the non urban world in addition to the benefits of living in a city, of being in a city in an urban environment. So you say that there has been higher unemployment rates among men that are of prime working age, and you call it America's most unsolved social problem. A few weeks ago, I interviewed Michael Strain from AI about his new book, and he talks about this as an issue that America faces. Can you talk to us about that? How big of a problem is it?
Uh, it's a huge problem, and it's a problem that the COVID-19 epidemic is only going to make worse. So if you think about, I was born 53 years ago in 1967, and around that time, roughly 1 in 20 prime-aged males were jobless. Prime-aged is defined by the census as being from 25 to 54. And I'm focusing on men just because female labor force participation is more complicated. It's changed over time for a variety of different reasons, and it doesn't suggest any sense in which male labor force participation is more important than women's. It's just a simpler thing. Over the
Mhm.
past 50 years, 53 years, um, male joblessness has increased from 5% to 15% for much of the past decade. Um, and when you look at sort of male non-employment, there are plenty of women who are not formally employed, who are doing very productive things and who are perfectly satisfied with their lives. Right, they're taking care of their relatives, their children, they're contributing in major ways to the world. Very few men who are not formally employed, who are prime years, are actually doing anything like that. If you look at how their time changes, they're not caring for people, they're watching huge amounts of television typically. If you look at the sort of human misery, like there are small differences between being earning a lot and earning a little in happiness. There are self-reported happiness, there are massive differences between earning a little and being unemployed. And I think that reminds you, and this is sort of also an important thing for all listeners to reflect on, that in fact true life satisfaction is very rarely associated with how much you own, with how much money you have. Life satisfaction comes from like the sense of purpose and from social connection. Those are two sort of crucial ingredients in determining who we are. And when you're jobless, you typically lack both of those. You lack both a sense of purpose and the sort of social safety net that's so, so crucial. Um, so that's why I think this is a huge problem. And obviously, it's related to mechanization of industry and the ability to transition to work in the service sector. The if you think about sort of the arc of American employment, we've moved from farm to factory to urban service workers, and 1/5 of American jobs are in retail, trade, leisure, and hospitality. These jobs have provided a relative safe haven from mechanization because people still seem to be willing to pay a bit extra for a latte served with a compliment and a smile. Um, but those jobs are not available everywhere, right? Those jobs are available in New York and Seattle and San Francisco. There are many fewer of them in places that don't have viable export industries like West Virginia. And they also seem to be something that middle-aged men are often bad at. And my wife will tell you, like many middle-aged men, I am not necessarily so great at being nice to random strangers, and that's actually a kind of a crucial ingredient in being successful in these service sector industries. So that's the challenge. And now, unfortunately, this move from manufacturing to urban service workers has left this fifth of the American economy that's in retail, trade, leisure, and hospitality uniquely vulnerable to a pandemic that means that a stranger serving your coffee becomes a source of fear rather than a source of pleasure.
Wow. I mean, it's also even just like outside of the service industry, low skill jobs like plumbing and well, I mean, plumbing isn't completely low skilled, but like comparatively, um, and like mechanics type thing. It must be easier to find work in a city than in non-urban areas, right? So that
Absolutely.
must contribute also. But so, what I think about is how, when the transition happened from being like where Detroit was, the big part of the Detroit economy was cars, like the automotive industry. And then no one could imagine how Detroit could survive without that. And then we've kind of moved away from that, and Detroit's kind of making a comeback. And cities like Seattle, when Boeing kind of retracted from Seattle, it still made a revival. It still was a booming place. But if cities can do that, can non urban places do that?
It's harder because if you think about how Seattle came back, the thing I always like to remind people is in 1971, two jokers put a billboard on the highway leaving Seattle saying, asking the last person to leave the city, would you please turn out the lights? Um, and, this is before Microsoft, before Amazon, before Costco, before Starbucks. And, what enabled Seattle to come back is highly skilled people. The engineers at Boeing had made sure the public schools were good in the area, and they had this reservoir of highly skilled talent that was then a perfect place to locate Microsoft and a perfect place to locate Amazon. And this is what enabled the city to sort of, you know, innovate its way back to being on the cutting edge of everything. Now, Detroit has come back a little bit, but of course, it's come back with less than half the number of people, and so there was a lot of shrinking to greatness that needed to occur. Um, so, in the case of the sort of West Virginias of the world, I, I think there needs to be a lot of entrepreneurial thought into this. I mean, it's not something that you could plan from the top down at all. I have
Hmm.
never, I will never bet against the ingenuity of American entrepreneurs, and so I continue to be hopeful. But I have to say, I can't be confident that I know what the entrepreneurs of the future will figure out for people to do in West Virginia, apart from the obvious things like leisure and hospitality, where you'd think it would be particularly have a particularly valuable endowment. Um, so I do believe that we should have public policies that are more pro-employment in places like West Virginia. So that doesn't mean necessarily subsidizing people to move away from New York to West Virginia. I've always been skeptical about that kind of placemaking policy, but I'm not skeptical about having policies that are better suited for the particular place. And so the right policies around unemployment insurance or disability insurance are very likely to be different in a place with a high level of employment like Seattle, at least pre COVID 19, and a place with a very high level of unemployment like Appalachia.
So you kind of mentioned public policy and like being pro employment. So, what do you think about policies that feed into suburban living, like federal highway programs or mortgage tax deductions, or even public calls for low gas prices? Can you talk
Oh,
to us about that?
oh, counselor, I fear you're leading the witness on this. Yeah, yes, well, I have very strong feelings on this, which is I think that the right job of the federal government is to not play favorites about particular locations. This means I don't think they should be artificially subsidizing cities, but I don't think they should have policies that are strongly anti city afterwards. There's a very strong correlation between structure type and ownership type. The overwhelming share of single family detached houses in this country are owner occupied. The overwhelming share of multifamily dwellings are rented. And when you are subsidizing home ownership, you are pushing people out of urban apartments into suburban homes. The same basic point holds for the subsidization of highways, which, at least until 15 years ago, were paid for by drivers themselves through gas taxes. Over the past 15 years, we've increasingly funded the Highway Trust Fund with general tax revenues, which means if you're taking public transportation in San Francisco, your federal tax dollars are going to fund people to build highways to commute long distances in the middle of the country. And it's very hard to think of a world in which you don't want to have the users of transport modes pay for those transport modes. It's very hard to think of a world which, if you worry at all about carbon emissions, that you wouldn't want to, tax people from driving instead of artificially subsidize people for driving. And these are policies that, they usually weren't explicitly spatial in their design, but they do have strong spatial components. And they're wrapped up in an American mythology that seems to suggest that there's only one way to have an American dream. The American dream only lies behind a white picket fence in the suburbs. And that's just not so. The greatness of America is in the diversity that it offers, just like the greatness of good cities are that they offer archipelagos of different neighborhoods. And so there's nothing wrong with pursuing your future in a ranch in the Dakotas or in a suburb of Cleveland. Those are perfectly good and worthy choices, but there's also nothing wrong with pursuing your future in an apartment in central Chicago either. And we shouldn't have public policy that favors one of those options over another one.
The downside of people moving back to cities or moving into cities in general is that it increases demand. Um, and that in turn raises housing prices. So I would think that unless we build more homes to meet the present and future demand for homes in cities or apartments in cities, then the price would keep going up. But in your book, Triumph of Cities, and elsewhere in your work, you make the case for building up instead of building out, kind of. Just like up, up, up and up and up. So, unfortunately, I've done some research into this, and you've mentioned in your work that there are many rules and regulations, zoning and land use rules, mostly at the local level, that forbid construction that goes up. So, before we get into the arguments of what people make for these rules, can you give us an example of some of the zoning rules and can you tell us the biggest impact of these rules?
So we've had for over a century, we've had fairly stringent forms of zoning regulation of a variety of different forms. So in the case of large cities, typically the most important things are the various limitations to adding height or the difficulty of taking older buildings and replacing them with newer buildings. And just to be clear, I actually believe that architectural history is a big part of cities. I just don't think that every older building needs to be preserved. In suburbs, we have lots of limitation on how densely you can build. And all of these things act as brakes on supply. And when you have robust demand for any community collide against fixed supply, the impact will be too little population growth and too much price growth. And that's exactly what we've seen over the past 20 years, is that by artificially restricting new construction, places like New York become far more expensive than they need to be. And just to give the most absurd example of that is over much of the past 50 years, the city of Mumbai in India has labored under a Town and Country Planning Act that is borrowed from the British and that restricts density levels to 1.25 stories on average. So you can have a 3 story building, but only if you use half the space. You can have a 6 story building, but only if you can use a quarter of the space. So that's a very strong limitation on how much density you can build. And as a result, Mumbai sprawls out rather than building up. And the building that does occur is often not legal because they're just completely ignoring the rules.
That's dang. I mean, I feel like if the rules are just being ignored, then I don't know. Why are they?
Why are
I
they
don't know.
there? Yes.
I don't know. But
Yeah, yeah, and look, it's not as if you're right. I'm an advocate of skyscrapers, but to be clear, I'm not necessarily an advocate that any one person should live in them or that we should subsidize them. I'm really just an advocate of people's freedom to build them. I'm really just an advocate of people having the ability to add more density when they want to, when the market demands it.
I mean, free the people. It's the will of the people, so let it happen. So, kind of going into arguments that people make for zoning laws. What would you say to someone who says that it's good for the environment that zoning laws prevent construction?
So often it goes in the wrong direction, meaning that you instead of building up, you build out, and we know that the carbon emissions associated with suburban lifestyles appear to be higher than those associated with cities, holding income and family size constant. So I wrote a paper with Matthew Kahn called "The Greenness of Cities," where we estimate carbon emissions associated with living in different parts of the country. And typically, urbanites tend to use less carbon in terms of their non-work life, and that's coming from both smaller urban apartments relative to large suburban homes and just much less driving. And if you're talking about Americans, they're still driving in cities. I mean, they're not overwhelmingly taking public transportation, but they're just driving much shorter distances. And so the right environmental thing is to allow the cities to build up so you don't end up building out.
So, what would you say to someone who says that zoning laws prevent the construction of multifamily homes in cities, which is important for the school system, because otherwise the school would run over the capacity?
So I think if you really think that's an issue, then we're not taxing either building or existing real estate enough, right? And the basic principle should be that if you're building something, you should be paying enough either in real estate taxes, or I have nothing wrong with charging some sort of fee if we really think the new homes aren't paying for their weight of public infrastructure. Certainly in New York City, where I've estimated this, the real estate taxes generated by any of the new apartments more than cover the cost of adding more infrastructure, adding more teaching staff. Um, so I don't, I don't think that this needs to be a conflict. You just need to make sure that the people who build are then contributing enough to the public finances to cover these costs.
What about how zoning and land use regulation help preserve the aesthetic of neighborhoods?
So there's more of a case. I think so. Certainly, if you, in the case of historic preservation, there are some buildings that need to be preserved. I'm the son of an architectural historian. I believe that some of our old buildings are as precious as anything that hangs in the National Gallery or the Louvre. Um, but not every building needs to be protected. And often some of the most precious architectural moments are those where there's a dialogue between a 19th century architect and a 21st century architect. So, preserving the past for most older urban spaces does not, in fact, create something that's I think all that exciting most of the time. And I think in general, governments are not great at making aesthetic decisions on a micro level. And I think most of the time you're better off letting individual owners make decisions and trust that they're going to come to something that's, they're not going to want to create an ugly building because they're going to want to sell or rent those units.
Hmm. So, I've heard Brian Kaplan at GMU make the case that zoning and land use regulation play an oversized role in promoting income inequality because they prevent people in high unemployment, low wage areas to move to cities with high wages or higher wages than where they are. You've done a lot of work on this. So, can you talk to us about it a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's one of the barriers to moving to successful cities. And when you sort of look at the difference in wages, let's just take our service occupations between, let's say someplace in Georgia and San Francisco, the difference in bartenders' wages is really quite considerable, right? You're earning, twice as much in San Francisco tending bar, and I'm taking bartending because it seems like a job that lots of people can do. Um, but that wage difference gets eaten up by San Francisco housing costs pretty quickly. And those housing costs are in turn a reflection of how difficult it is to build in San Francisco. So if you allowed more construction in San Francisco, you reduce those housing costs, and that would mean that the sort of price of moving into these areas was not so much of a barrier to finding a brighter economic future.
So, about this pandemic, has it changed your position on cities at all?
So, in some sense, with historical perspective, we've gone through a blessed century in terms of the health of cities. For most of urban history, cities have often been killing fields, from the plague of Athens that slew Pericles in 430 BC to the plague of Justinian in 542. Cities have enabled just as proximity enables us to talk more easily, or for me to sell you something like a newspaper, it also promotes the spread of bacteria and viruses. And of course, we're seeing that today most terribly. And it's both about the urban density enabling the disease to spread within a city, and the fact that cities are nodes of our great urban travel network. And so diseases hop from city to city first. And that was true. The port of Piraeus was the entry point of plague into classical Athens. So that's facing us today. Now, I think there are two possibilities for this plague going forward, and it depends a lot as to whether or not this ends up being a sort of permanent multi-year thing, or whether or not this is a shorter term horror that comes and goes. So if this looks more like a shorter term thing, meaning that we come up with a vaccine pretty soon, we put the needed public health protections in place to make sure this never happens again, then I think by and large cities get back to normal. Now, even so, there will be people who have converted to remote work, and there are companies that are saying that they're going to allow that going forward. We've done a poll of leading business economists, and I would say about 35 to 40% say a fairly sizable fraction of the workers who have transitioned to remote work during the crisis will stay there. And so that's going to be a negative hit on cities, even if cities get healthier. That's going to be a negative hit on commercial real estate. But don't start believing in that scenario, in the scenario that like we get the health problems under control, that all of a sudden we'll have vacant towers in downtown Manhattan. What happens in the high demand cities is that prices drop and then the space gets filled up again. So you expect to see a significant price adjustment, but not one that fundamentally changes the character of the city. In the second scenario, in the darker scenario, where either this pandemic doesn't get cured for years, or then maybe new pandemics start arriving with a more regular space, in those areas, then I think we should be justifiably afraid that urban service jobs are sort of perpetually going to be reduced. People are going to be terrified of public transportation going forward, and cities are themselves going to be facing a very steep challenge. And that is, unfortunately, that possibility is also out there in the history. While cities recovered quite easily from the 1919 influenza epidemic, and the 20s was a great period for urbanization, by contrast, the plague of Justinian, which hit in 542, was followed by 200 years of recurrence of this wave of the Black Death of Yersinia Pestis, and that really decimated urbanization in Europe for close to a millennium.
So, finally, what is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you've later changed your position on, and why?
Uh, there are, I think, a lot of things that I've changed my position on. Uh, so I certainly, for example, one of my biggest mistakes was I was pretty good on seeing the housing crash coming in 06, 07. Uh, but I wasn't good at anticipating just how horrific that would be for the U.S. economy. Because I thought that, much as I'm saying now, prices will go down. That's probably a good thing for affordability. So that's not so terrible. I didn't see the extent to which that will reverberate throughout history. So I think that's one of the larger mistakes I've made in the world of economic policy guidance and forecasting. Uh, in terms of this, I think in terms of things that I've changed myself over time, I've had a very, very lucky life in terms of, having a job that brings me a great deal of purpose and value. And I think over time, I've come to realize how much more important it is to, to leave value on the table for the people who are around you. That in fact, and probably the single biggest, easiest lesson is that you should never miss a chance to give someone honest praise when you have that chance. And I will say, sort of the memory that really sticks strongly in me was this is a very dear friend of mine, a very dear colleague of mine, Alberto Alcina, died over the weekend, and he's a great loss for our department, for the profession, for me personally. But my wife reminded me that the last email that I sent him was an email thanking him and praising him for doing a great job advising one of our joint students, and which I think he appreciated. And I was just so glad that that was the last thing of any substance that I'd sent to him. And it just, reminds you, just never lose a chance to make someone else feel good if you can do so honestly.
I mean, that's a horrible event, but it's a good thing to get out of it, right? I mean, just knowing that at least you at least you showed him you valued him, right? And you can now remember that, and now we can all remember that. So, thank you so much for your time. This was incredible. It was awesome. I have so much to learn on all of these issues still, but I'm going to keep doing research. I'm going to keep looking into it, and I hope that my listeners will as well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, take care.